The grand ballroom of the Sharon in Arlington, Virginia, glittered with brass buttons and polished metals. Chandeliers cast warm light over hundreds of guests gathered for the annual Military Honor Gala, a night reserved for generals, decorated officers, and their distinguished families. And somewhere near the entrance, a man in a simple gray suit held his daughter's hand, trying to remember how to breathe. Mark Dalton hadn't worn a tie in 3 years. The last time had been at his wife's funeral, and the memory still burned somewhere beneath his ribs. But tonight wasn't about him. Tonight was about a promise he'd made to a woman who wasn't here to see it kept. Lily tugged at his sleeve, her eyes wide as she took in the spectacle before them. Crystal glasses clinked. Laughter echoed off marble floors. Women in elegant gowns glided past men whose chests bore enough ribbons to tell 100 stories of sacrifice. To a 7-year-old girl from a small town in Pennsylvania, it must have looked like stepping into a movie. "Daddy, this is where Mommy worked." Mark's throat tightened. "Not exactly, sweetheart, but this is where people like Mommy get remembered. She would have wanted you to see it." He squeezed her small hand and stepped forward, only to find his path blocked by a security guard, whose expression suggested Mark had already committed some unforgivable offense simply by existing. The guard was tall, broad-shouldered, with a shaved head that reflected the chandelier light like a warning beacon. His name tag read Patterson, and his eyes performed a surgical scan of Mark's appearance. From the slightly worn shoes to the department store suit to the absence of any visible military insignia. "Sir," the word came out like an accusation. "This is a private event. Invitation only." Mark reached into his jacket pocket and produced his phone. Pulling up the email confirmation he'd received 3 weeks ago. "I have an invitation right here. Mark Dalton plus 1 guest." Patterson barely glanced at the screen before shaking his head. "I'm going to need to see physical documentation. A printed invitation or official correspondence on letterhead. I wasn't sent anything physical, just the email." "Then I can't verify your identity, sir. This gala hosts some of the highest-ranking military officials in the country. We don't take chances with security." Lily pressed closer to Mark's leg, her earlier excitement dissolving into uncertainty. She could sense the shift in atmosphere, the way other guests were beginning to notice the commotion at the entrance. A woman in pearls paused mid-con conversation to stare. A colonel with silver hair raised an eyebrow before deliberately turning away. "Look," Mark said, keeping his voice level. "I understand you're doing your job, but I'm on the list. If you could just check with your supervisor or call the event coordinator. The coordinator is occupied with actual guests." Sir Patterson's emphasis on the word actual landed like a slap. "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." A second guard appeared. Younger, but equally skeptical. Together they formed a wall of institutional rejection that Mark recognized all too well. He'd encountered it at the VA when trying to access his wife's medical records. He'd faced it at the insurance company when they denied her experimental treatment. He'd learned that sometimes systems weren't designed to help people. They were designed to sort them, to separate the worthy from the unworthy based on criteria that had nothing to do with truth. But he'd also learned that fighting those systems rarely accomplished anything except exhausting what little energy he had left. "Please," he said quietly. "I just want to show my daughter where her mother served. That's all. We'll stay in the back. We won't bother anyone." Patterson's expression didn't change. "Sir, I need you to step outside while we verify your information. If everything checks out, you'll be allowed entry. If not, you'll need to leave the premises." Behind him, Mark heard whispers. He didn't need to turn around to know what they were saying. The words floated toward him like smoke from a distant fire. Impossible to ignore. Who was that? Some civilian, apparently. Can you imagine? Trying to crash a military gala. Look at how he's dressed. Probably hoping for a free dinner. Security should have caught him at the door. This is embarrassing. Mark felt his jaw tighten, but he said nothing. He'd learned long ago that defending himself only made things worse. Instead, he looked down at Lily, whose lower lip had begun to tremble. "Daddy, are we in trouble?"
"No, sweetheart.
"There's just been a misunderstanding. It'll be okay." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. the gala had been difficult enough to gain access to in the first place. His wife's former commanding officer had helped arrange the invitation before passing away 6 months ago. Whatever records existed of that arrangement had apparently died with him. Patterson gestured toward the exit. "This way, sir." Mark didn't move. Not out of defiance, but because his feet suddenly felt welded to the floor. He'd promised Rebecca. He'd promised her that when Lily was old enough, he'd bring her here to this annual gathering of the people Rebecca had served alongside. He'd show Lily the world her mother had been part of, the community that had shaped her, the values she'd fought to protect. And now, 3 years after Rebecca's death, he was being escorted out like a trespasser. The younger guard reached for Mark's arm, and Lily flinched. The small movement sent a spike of protective fury through Mark's chest, but he forced it down. Causing a scene would only frighten her more. It would only prove the whispers right. So he took a breath, placed his hand on Lily's shoulder, and prepared to walk away from the promise he'd traveled 400 miles to keep. That's when he noticed her. A young woman in a dark blue dress uniform stood near the entrance to the main hall. She was perhaps 18 or 19, with auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun and the silver insignia of a military academy cadet on her collar. She'd been watching the entire exchange, and her expression was strange. A mixture of confusion and recognition that didn't quite make sense. Their eyes met for just a moment. Mark didn't know her. He was certain of it, and yet something in her gaze suggested she knew him, or at least knew something about him that he'd tried very hard to forget. The younger guard's hand closed around Mark's elbow. The woman in the dress uniform took a step forward, and the whispers around them grew louder. Patterson's grip on the situation tightened along with his grip on Mark's other arm. "Sir, you need to come with us now. You're causing a disruption." "I'm not resisting," Mark said calmly. "I'm cooperating, but please don't frighten my daughter." Lily had begun to cry. Soft, hiccuping sobs that she tried desperately to muffle against Mark's leg. She didn't understand what was happening, only that her father was being treated like a criminal, and she was powerless to stop it. "Daddy, I want to go home," she whispered. "Please, can we just go home?" The words cut through Mark like shrapnel. He dragged her across state lines for this. He'd saved for months to afford the hotel room, the gas, the new dress she was wearing under her coat. He told her stories about her mother the entire drive, preparing her for a night that was supposed to feel like a homecoming. Instead, she was watching strangers pull her father toward the exit while wealthy guests looked on with a mixture of pity and disgust. Patterson spoke into his radio. "We have a situation at the main entrance. Possible gate crasher. Requesting backup." "I'm not a gate crasher," Mark said, his patience finally cracking at the edges. "I was invited. My wife served 20 years in the army. She died 3 years ago from complications related to her service. This gala is supposed to honor people like her. And I brought our daughter here to see that, to feel connected to her mother's legacy. That's all I wanted." The words hung in the air between them, naked and raw. For a moment, Patterson's expression flickered with something that might have been doubt. But then the backup arrived. 2 more guards with the same suspicious eyes. And the moment passed. "Let's go," Patterson said. "We can sort this out in the security office." They began to pull Mark toward the door. Lily cried harder, her small hands clutching his jacket so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Don't take my daddy. Please don't take my daddy." The sound of her voice echoed through the ballroom, cutting through the ambient music and conversation. Heads turned. Conversation stopped for a few horrible seconds. Every eye in the room was fixed on the scene, unfolding at the entrance. Mark stopped struggling. He dropped to one knee and gathered Lily in his arms, holding her close, even as the guards maintained their grip on his shoulders. "Listen to me," he whispered against her hair. "I need you to be brave, okay? Like Mommy was brave. Whatever happens, I'm not going anywhere. I'll always be right here. I promise. But they're hurting you."
No, sweetheart.
"They're just confused. It's going to be okay." He kissed her forehead and stood, ready to let the guards escort him out. There was no point in fighting. There never had been. The system would do what systems always did. grind down anyone who didn't fit neatly into its categories. Mark Dalton, unemployed widower from rural Pennsylvania, did not belong in a room full of generals and their families. The sooner he accepted that, the sooner he could get Lily out of here and begin the long process of explaining why the world sometimes treated good people like suspects. But before they could take another step toward the exit, a voice rang out across the ballroom. Stop. It wasn't loud, but it carried authority. The kind of authority that came from certainty, from absolute conviction. The guards froze. The whispers died, and every head in the room turned toward the young woman in the dress uniform, who was now walking directly toward them. She moved with purpose, her posture military perfect. Her gaze fixed on Mark with an intensity that made his skin prickle with unease. He still didn't recognize her. He'd spent years deliberately avoiding the military community after Rebecca died, severing every connection to that world so completely that he might as well have never been part of it. But this young woman clearly hadn't received that memo. She stopped 3 feet away from the guards, close enough that Mark could see the subtle tremor in her hands, the rapid pulse visible at her throat. She was nervous. He realized whatever she was about to do scared her almost as much as it scared him. "Release him," she said. Immediately. Patterson recovered first. "Miss, this is a security matter. Please return to the event." I said, "Release him." Her voice sharpened, gaining an edge that made her sound twice her age. "This man is not a gatecrasher. He's not a threat. And if you put your hands on him again, you'll answer to my father." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. Patterson cleared his throat. "And who exactly is your father?" The young woman's chin lifted slightly. "General James Harrington, commander of the 3rd Infantry Division, and the man this soldier saved in Kandahar 11 years ago." A ripple of shock passed through the assembled crowd. Patterson's grip loosened involuntarily, and Mark felt the blood drain from his face. No one was supposed to know about Kandahar. The mission had been classified at the highest level. Every participant had signed agreements, binding them to silence for the rest of their lives. Even Rebecca hadn't known the details, only that Mark had come home different, quieter, burdened by something he refused to discuss. And yet this girl, this teenager he'd never met, was standing in the middle of a crowded ballroom and speaking the unspeakable. "You're mistaken," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what you're talking about." But the young woman shook her head, and when she spoke again, her voice was gentler, almost tender. "I'm not mistaken, and neither are you, Ghost Watcher." The name hit Mark like a fist to the chest. He hadn't heard it spoken aloud in over a decade. It was a call sign, a ghost from another life, a title he'd earned through actions so dark and desperate that he'd spent years trying to burn them from his memory. "How do you know that name?" he demanded. "Because my father told me." She took a step closer. And for the first time, Mark noticed the tears gathering in her eyes. "He told me everything about the ambush, about the men who died, about the soldier who carried him 6 miles through enemy territory with 2 bullets in his own shoulder, who refused extraction until every survivor was accounted for, who saved 15 lives and asked for nothing in return." She reached out and touched his arm, and her hand was shaking. "He told me that soldier's name was Mark Dalton, and he told me that if I ever saw him again, I should thank him for giving me my father." The ballroom had gone completely silent. Patterson and the other guards stood frozen, their earlier aggression replaced by something that looked remarkably like shame. The guests, who had been whispering moments ago, now stared with wide eyes and open mouths. And Mark Dalton, the man they'd been ready to throw out like garbage, stood in the center of it all and felt his carefully constructed walls begin to crack. "Emily," he said finally, the name surfacing from some long-buried memory. "You're Emily." He used to carry a picture of you in his vest pocket. "You were the only thing that mattered." Emily nodded, tears streaming freely now. "I was 7 when it happened, the same age as your daughter." She glanced at Lily, who was watching the exchange with wide, confused eyes. "He told me that a brave man named Ghost Watcher was the reason I still had a daddy. I didn't understand at first, but I've never forgotten." She turned to face the guards, her voice hardening again. "This man is a decorated war hero. His file was classified because the mission was classified, but that doesn't make his service any less real. He belongs at this gala, more than half the people in this room. Her gaze swept across the crowd, landing briefly on those who had whispered the loudest. And anyone who says otherwise can take it up with General Harrington directly. Patterson swallowed visibly. Miss Harrington, we had no way of knowing. No, you had every way of knowing. You chose not to look. Emily's eyes were like winter ice.
His name was on the guest list.
His invitation was valid. But you saw a man who didn't fit your expectations. And you decided he must be a fraud. She paused, letting the accusation hang in the air. That's not security. That's prejudice. Wearing a uniform. The words landed like grenades in the silent ballroom. Mark watched as faces flushed with shame, as eyes dropped to the floor. As the same people who had dismissed him moments ago suddenly found their champagne glasses extremely fascinating, but he didn't feel vindicated. He felt exposed, raw, like someone had torn off a bandage he'd spent years applying, revealing wounds that had never properly healed. I appreciate what you're doing, he said quietly, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. But I didn't come here for recognition. I came for my daughter. That's all. Emily's expression softened.
I know. My father told me that too.
He said, you refused every medal, every commendation, every opportunity for advancement. You just wanted to go home to your wife. She paused. He also told me about Rebecca, about her service, about what happened. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I'm so sorry, Mark, for everything. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Lily tugged at Mark's hand, her tear-stained face full of questions he wasn't ready to answer. Daddy, what's she talking about? What's a ghost watcher? Mark knelt down to meet his daughter's eyes. The same green eyes Rebecca had passed on to her and felt his heart break in a dozen different places. It's a name from a long time ago, sweetheart. From before you were born. Were you a soldier like Mommy? The question was so simple, so innocent. But the answer was anything but. Yes, he said finally for a little while. But that was a different life. He stood and turned to Emily, who was watching the exchange with an expression that suggested she understood far more than her years should allow. Thank you, he said, for stepping in, for remembering. You saved my father, Emily replied. You gave me my whole life. There's nothing to thank. She gestured toward the main ballroom where the other guests had begun to resume their conversations, though with considerably less judgment in their glances.
Please stay.
The gala hasn't even started yet, and I know for a fact that you're supposed to be here.
She paused.
My father would want you to stay. He's been trying to find you for years. Mark hesitated. The last thing he wanted was to become the center of attention, to have his past paraded before a room full of strangers. But then he looked down at Lily, whose eyes were still wide with wonder despite everything that had happened. And he remembered why he'd come. Not for himself. Never for himself. For Rebecca. For the promise he'd made as she lay dying in that hospital bed, her hand growing cold in his. Okay, he said quietly. We'll stay. Patterson stepped forward, his entire demeanor transformed. Mr. Dalton, I owe you an apology, a sincere one. I should have listened. I should have verified. Instead, he stopped, seemingly unable to finish the sentence. You did your job, Mark said. Or what you thought was your job. Let's leave it at that. But even as he offered the words, he couldn't quite make them feel true. Because the truth was more complicated than that. The truth was that Mark Dalton had spent years making himself invisible, stripping away every connection to his former life, becoming just another single father, struggling to make ends meet in a world that had moved on without him. He'd done it on purpose. He'd done it for Lily. And now, standing in this glittering ballroom, surrounded by people who suddenly wanted to know his story, he realized that invisibility had been both his prison and his protection. Emily took his arm and began leading him toward the main hall. Behind them, Lily clutched his free hand, still processing everything she'd witnessed. And ahead of them, the ballroom stretched out like a battlefield Mark had never expected to revisit. As they walked, guests began to approach. Some offered handshakes and formal greetings. Others simply nodded with respect. A few veterans his own age clasped his shoulder and murmured things like, "Welcome back, brother, and about time they recognized you." Mark accepted their words with quiet grace. But inside, he was drowning. Every greeting reminded him of the men he'd failed to save. Every mention of heroism felt like a knife twisting in a wound that had never stopped bleeding. He hadn't come here to be celebrated. He'd come here to show Lily where her mother had stood, to connect his daughter to a legacy she deserved to understand. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. They stopped near a small alcove overlooking the ballroom. Emily excused herself briefly to speak with an officer, leaving Mark and Lily alone for the first time since the confrontation.
Daddy.
Yes, sweetheart. Lily's brow was furrowed with concentration. The way it always was when she was trying to understand something beyond her years. That lady said you saved her daddy. Like a superhero. Mark knelt down, his knees protesting the motion. Not like a superhero. I was just a soldier. We were in a dangerous place and bad things happened, and I did what I could to help. That's all. But she said you got hurt. She said there were bullets. I did get hurt a long time ago. But I got better. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the question Mark had been dreading since before she was born. Is that why you're so sad sometimes? The words were a child's words, innocent and devastating in their honesty. Because Lily was right. Mark was sad sometimes. More than sometimes. He carried a darkness inside him that no amount of time or therapy had been able to fully dispel. And until now, he'd convinced himself that Lily was too young to notice. I'm not sad, he said, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. Yes, you are. Lily reached up and touched his face with her small hand. When you think I'm asleep, when you look at Mommy's pictures, I can tell. Mark closed his eyes and felt something fracture in his chest. He tried so hard to protect her from this. He tried so hard to be enough, to be both mother and father, to fill the void that Rebecca's death had left in both their lives. But he wasn't enough. He'd never been enough. And now his daughter, his beautiful 7-year-old daughter, who deserved nothing but sunshine and joy, was watching him with eyes that saw far too much. Come here, he said, and pulled her into a hug that he never wanted to end. You're the only thing that makes the sadness bearable. Because I remind you of Mommy, because you are Mommy. The best parts of her. The parts that matter most. They held each other for a long moment. This broken man and his beautiful daughter. Surrounded by strangers who had finally stopped looking at them with suspicion. And when Mark finally pulled back, he saw Emily approaching with an expression that suggested something had changed. Mark, she said, her voice carefully controlled. There's someone here who wants to speak with you. Someone I think you need to see. Before Mark could respond, a commotion at the far end of the ballroom drew everyone's attention. The crowd parted like water before a ship, creating a path for a figure moving slowly but deliberately toward them. He walked with a cane, his gait uneven but determined. His dress uniform bore more decorations than Mark could count, and his silver hair was cropped short in the military style he'd maintained for 40 years. But it was his eyes that Mark recognized first, sharp, fierce, burning with an intensity that time and injury had failed to diminish. General James Harrington, the man Mark had carried through 6 miles of hostile territory. The man who had named him Ghost Watcher, the man who had spent the last decade searching for a soldier who had vanished like smoke. Mark Dalton, the general said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom. You stubborn, impossible, infuriating son of a gun. I've been looking for you for 11 years. Mark straightened involuntarily. Old instincts taking over despite everything. General Harrington. Sir, I didn't expect me to be alive? Harrington's lips quirked into something that might have been a smile. Didn't expect me to remember. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for Mark to see the network of scars that mapped the left side of his face. Son, I remember every second of that night. Every step you took, every time you told me to hold on, that we were almost there. That my daughter was waiting for me. He reached out and clasped Mark's shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong. I remember you refusing morphine because you said you needed to stay sharp. I remember you tying your own tourniquet with your teeth because both your arms were occupied carrying my sorry carcass. And I remember waking up in a field hospital and asking where you were, only to be told that Sergeant Dalton had discharged himself against medical advice and disappeared. The words fell like stones into a still pond, creating ripples that Mark had spent years trying to escape. I had to go, Mark said quietly. Rebecca was pregnant. She was having complications. I needed to be there. I know. Harrington's voice softened. I found out later about the emergency leave, about Lily's early birth, about everything you sacrificed to be with your family. He paused. About Rebecca's passing.
I'm sorry, Mark.
More sorry than you can know. For a moment, neither man spoke. Around them, the ballroom remained frozen. Hundreds of guests bearing witness to a reunion 11 years in the making. Then Harrington turned to face the crowd, his bearing shifting into something Mark recognized immediately. The command presence, the voice that had led thousands of soldiers into battle and brought most of them home again. I want everyone here to listen carefully, the general said, because what I'm about to say matters more than any speech I've given in 40 years of service. He gestured toward Mark, who stood frozen beside him. This man is the reason I'm standing here today. This man is the reason my daughter has a father. This man carried me 6 miles through enemy territory, took 2 bullets, protecting my unconscious body, and saved the lives of 14 other soldiers before collapsing from blood loss. A murmur rippled through the crowd. He was offered the Medal of Honor. He refused. He was offered promotion to officer rank. He refused. He was offered a position on my personal staff with a path to a distinguished career. He refused everything. Harrington's voice cracked slightly because all he wanted was to go home to his wife and be there when his daughter was born. He turned back to Mark and there were tears in the old warrior's eyes. I don't know what you've been doing for the last 11 years, son. Not because of what you did in Kandahar, but because of who you are. Because you chose love over glory, family over fame, silence over celebration. He reached into his pocket and withdrew something small and metallic, something that caught the chandelier light and sparkled like a captured star. Rebecca knew. She knew everything. Even though you never told her, she reached out to me a few months before she passed, asked me to keep this safe, asked me to give it to Lily when she was old enough to understand. He pressed the object into Mark's trembling hand. It was a military dog tag, but not an ordinary one. On one side, Rebecca's name and service number were engraved in precise military lettering. On the other, a message in smaller script for my Lily. Your daddy is the bravest man I've ever known. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. Love, Mommy. Mark stared at the tag, his vision blurring with tears he'd refused to shed for 3 years. Rebecca had known. All along she'd known everything he'd tried to hide from her. And instead of being angry, instead of demanding explanations, she'd quietly honored his choice to remain silent while ensuring their daughter would someday learn the truth. I don't understand, he whispered. How did she? She found me, Harrington said gently. Tracked me down through unofficial channels. Said she'd noticed your nightmares, your scars, the way you flinched at certain sounds. She wanted to know what had happened to her husband. And when I told her, do you know what she said? Mark shook his head, unable to speak. She said, that sounds exactly like the man I married. The man who would burn himself to ash to keep someone else warm. And then she asked me to make this tag, to hold it until the right moment to make sure Lily knew who her father really was. The general placed his hand on Mark's shoulder again, anchoring him to reality. She didn't want you to carry this burden alone, son. She wanted Lily to share it with you, to be proud of it, to understand that her father's silence wasn't shame. It was sacrifice. Mark looked down at his daughter, who was staring up at him with an expression of pure awe. She didn't understand everything. She couldn't possibly understand everything, but she understood enough. Daddy, she whispered, you're a hero. And for the first time in 11 years, Mark Dalton didn't try to deny it. He knelt down and placed the dog tag around Lily's neck, the metal cool against her small chest. This is from Mommy, he said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. She wanted you to have it. She wanted you to know how much she loved both of us. Lily touched the tag with trembling fingers, reading the inscription without understanding all the words. But she understood the important ones. Daddy, bravest love. I miss her, she said simply. I miss her too, sweetheart. Every single day. He stood and faced General Harrington, extending his hand. Thank you, sir, for keeping this safe, for everything. Harrington ignored the hand and pulled Mark into a crushing hug. The kind of embrace that soldiers share when words aren't enough. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Welcome home, Ghost Watcher. It's about damn time. Around them, the ballroom erupted into applause. Not the polite, perfunctory clapping that had greeted earlier speeches, but genuine, thunderous appreciation. Officers, young and old, stepped forward to shake Mark's hand. Their wives approached to embrace Lily and tell her how proud she should be. Even Patterson, the security guard who had nearly thrown them out, stood at the edge of the crowd with his head bowed in something that looked like penance. Emily appeared at Mark's side, her smile radiant despite the tears still drying on her cheeks. I told you my father wanted you here. You also told me he'd been looking for me. Mark replied. I didn't realize how literal you were being. He never stopped. Even after he retired, he kept searching, hired investigators, called in favors, checked every database he could access.
She paused.
He said, finding you was the only unfinished business he had left, the only mission he hadn't completed. Mark looked across the ballroom at the general, who was now surrounded by well-wishers, but still watching Mark with an expression of profound satisfaction. He shouldn't have, Mark said quietly. I wasn't worth the effort. Yes, you were. Emily's voice was fierce.
You are.
And if you don't believe that yet, then spend some time with my father. He'll convince you. She glanced down at Lily, who was still clutching the dog tag like a talisman. Both of you should stay for the entire event. There's a ceremony later honoring fallen soldiers. Rebecca's name is on the memorial wall. My father made sure of it years ago. Even though he couldn't find you to tell you, Mark felt his throat tighten. He did that. He did a lot of things. He funded a scholarship in her name. He wrote letters to every member of Congress advocating for better veteran family support. Emily stopped, seemingly overwhelmed by the weight of her own words. He loved you both. Still does. Even though he'd never met you, he felt like you were family because you saved his life. And that made Lily's life possible. And that made everything possible. She touched his arm gently.
So please stay.
Let people thank you. Let Lily see her mother's name honored. Let yourself be part of this community again, even if it's just for one night. Mark looked around the ballroom at the faces that had judged him so harshly just an hour ago. Some still wore traces of shame. Others were openly curious, wanting to know more about the mysterious soldier who had apparently performed miracles. A few, the veterans who understood what it meant to carry invisible wounds, simply nodded with quiet respect. It wasn't the welcome he'd imagined. It was messier, more complicated, filled with contradictions and emotions he didn't know how to process. But Lily was smiling for the first time since they'd walked through those doors. His daughter was genuinely, unreservedly happy. Okay, he said finally. We'll stay. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of handshakes and conversations and moments that would take Mark weeks to fully process. He met colonels who had served with Rebecca and shared stories about her courage and humor. He spoke with young cadets who wanted to know what it took to become a soldier worth remembering. He held Lily's hand as they stood before the memorial wall and traced her mother's name with their fingers. The letters carved in stone, but somehow still alive with meaning. And when the final toast was raised, honoring the sacrifices of those who had served and those who had fallen, Mark Dalton raised his glass along with everyone else. Not as an outsider, not as an imposter, but as someone who belonged. Later, as the crowd began to thin and the ballroom settled into a quieter rhythm, Emily found him near the exit. Lily had fallen asleep in a chair nearby, exhausted by the emotional weight of the evening, clutching her mother's dog tag in her small fist. Thank you, Emily said simply, for everything you did then and now. Mark shook his head. I should be thanking you. If I hadn't stepped in, someone else would have eventually. She smiled. But I'm glad it was me. I've wanted to meet you my whole life.
To tell you what you mean to my family.
Your father already told me. My father told you facts. I'm telling you something different. She took his hand and held it with surprising strength. I'm telling you that every birthday I've had since I was 7 years old, I've thought about you. Every graduation, every achievement, every moment of joy, because you made them all possible. Her eyes glistened in the chandelier light.
I don't know how to repay something like that.
I don't think anyone does. But I wanted you to know that your sacrifice wasn't wasted. That the lives you saved went on to do good things, that my father has spent every day since Kandahar trying to be worthy of the chance you gave him. Mark was silent for a long moment. Then he reached out and pulled Emily into a hug. Brief, but fierce. He was always worthy, he said. From the moment I met him. That's why I couldn't let him die. When they separated, Emily was crying again, but they were different tears now. Tears of release rather than grief. Will you stay in touch? She asked. My father would love to see you again properly this time without the chaos in the crowds. Mark glanced at Lily, still sleeping peacefully in her chair. I think I'd like that. Good. Emily wiped her eyes and straightened her uniform. She walked away to rejoin her father, leaving Mark alone with his thoughts and his sleeping daughter and the weight of a past he could no longer escape. But for the first time in 11 years, the weight didn't feel like a burden. It felt like an anchor. He crossed the room and gently lifted Lily into his arms. She stirred slightly, murmuring something unintelligible, then settled against his chest with a contented sigh. The dog tag pressed between them, warm from her body heat, a bridge between past and present. Time to go home, sweetheart, Mark whispered. But even as he said it, he realized that home meant something different now. It wasn't just the small apartment in Pennsylvania, where they'd been surviving rather than living. It wasn't just the absence of Rebecca, the empty chair at dinner, the silence where her laughter used to be. Home was wherever Lily was. Home was wherever the truth lived. And tonight, for the first time since Rebecca's death, Mark had allowed the truth to breathe. He walked toward the exit, past the guards who now stood at attention as he passed. Past the guests who nodded with respect instead of suspicion. Past the chandeliers that cast golden light on a ballroom that had witnessed something unexpected and profound. At the door, he paused and looked back one final time. General Harrington caught his eye from across the room and raised his hand in a simple salute. Not the formal military gesture, but something more personal. A farewell between brothers. Mark returned the salute, then stepped out into the cool Virginia night. The stars were bright overhead, scattered across the darkness like promises. Lily slept peacefully in his arms, dreaming whatever dreams 7-year-olds dream after witnessing their father become a hero. And Mark Dalton, former soldier, widowed father, and reluctant legend, began the long walk back to their hotel. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know if he'd ever fully escape the shadows of his past or the weight of his grief. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was done hiding. Rebecca had known the truth and loved him anyway. Lily now knew the truth and loved him even more. And somewhere in that ballroom, a general and his daughter were grateful for a sacrifice that Mark had never expected to be remembered. He wasn't just a single father anymore. He wasn't just a widower or a veteran or a ghost of the man he used to be. He was Mark Dalton, ghost watcher, hero. And for the first time in 11 years, he was proud of who that man had become.